Hello there. It's good to see you again. Trial of Swordmancy, the mode introduced during the official broadcast, finally arrived on June 12th. To be completely honest, I was looking forward to this update even more than Contingency Contract. More than another limited time challenge, what Endfield desperately needed was a permanent activity that players would actually want to spend time with. I was curious. What direction does Hypergriff see for Endfield's future? What does a true long-term endgame activity look like in a game built around factories, operators, equipment, and all the systems that make Endfield different? I wanted to spend several days experimenting. Trying different teams. Testing unusual strategies. Thinking carefully before sharing my thoughts. Unfortunately, there simply wasn't enough here to do that. At least not enough to fill the long silence between updates. Of course, this is only my personal experience. Some players may have enjoyed it much more than I did. And as always, different experiences lead to different opinions. With that said, let's not waste any more time. Let's begin. The biggest difference between Trial of Swordmancy and previous endgame activities is that it finally allows players to use automated turrets and consumable items. For me, this was the most promising direction of the entire update. All those healing items, food buffs, batteries, and various supplies that had been gathering dust in the corner of my storage finally found a purpose. And having a warp point nearby to restore HP and restock supplies makes the system much more convenient. But unfortunately, this isn't a perfect solution. The arena is fairly large, yet we're limited to placing only 3 turrets. The battles themselves are also too short to consume a meaningful amount of resources. More importantly, after completing the 3 reward battles, there isn't much motivation to continue. Outside of different enemy combinations, each run remains largely the same. And for a mode designed around repeated play, that's a concern. The enemy lineup and their overall strength are determined by combining data plates inspired by Mahjong tiles. On paper, the idea seems promising. Seeing enemies from completely different regions appear together creates situations that simply weren't possible before. It punishes bad habits, and forces you to think. Considering that the current enemy pool is still relatively small, this is an area with plenty of room to grow through future updates. My concern is with the rewards. Once the trial arena is fully upgraded, players receive 2 opportunities each day to double their Wooling Management credit rewards. The amount of credits you receive depends on your data plate score. To obtain the maximum reward, you need to reach a score of 10. The problem is simple. The data plates are completely random. And because equipment progression is heavily tied to artificing catalysts, which themselves are limited by weekly purchases and not exactly cheap, I find it difficult to welcome randomness in a system directly connected to player growth. The metal coating requirement suffers from the same problem. To complete it, you need to clear a battle with an overflow score of 20 or higher. I wasn't fortunate enough to get the right combinations quickly, so I spent dozens of attempts re-rolling. Not because of poor strategy or bad execution. Simply because the game refused to give me the numbers I needed. And moments like that don't make me feel convinced. They make me feel like I am simply wasting my time. What makes a repetitive activity enjoyable is simple. Every run needs to feel at least slightly different. A different problem to solve. A different situation to react to. A different decision to make. And unfortunately, this is where Trial of Swordmancy struggles the most. Yes, enemy combinations change, and their overall strength changes. But at the end of the day, the way players approach combat doesn't change nearly enough. You still bring largely the same operators. You still rely on the same strategies and execution. After spending an entire day carefully exploring the mode, my final impression was rather disappointing. I expected a new playground, but what I found was another daily chore. That realization hurt my ego more than I expected. Before the update arrived, I had convinced myself that Hypergriff would use this mode as a foundation for future combat content. Especially with Contingency Contract only a week away, I imagined more unusual mechanics, more restrictions, and more opportunities to experiment. Apparently, I was giving it far more thought than the developers intended. This is probably why old otaku like me have a reputation for being annoying. I spend hours creating theories, convincing myself they make perfect sense. And then reality politely reminds me that I was completely wrong from the very beginning. Quite embarrassing, really. Increasing your data plate score naturally increases the number of enemies you have to face. Because of that, unless you deliberately create your own challenges or have a strong attachment to certain operators, the most effective teams become fairly obvious. Personally, I think there could have been more interesting choices. For example, a higher score could increase enemy strength while reducing their numbers. That would create a different type of challenge. Do you fight a small group of powerful enemies? Or do you deal with a battlefield full of weaker ones? That kind of decision would make the system feel much more strategic. In its current form, however, the arena often feels like controlled chaos. Enemies are running toward you from every direction. As a result, operators without super armor or strong area attack struggle to find a place. Not because they are weak. Not because players lack skill. But because the mode itself does not provide a reason to choose them. And that creates another uncomfortable thought. We just received Mifu, an operator who excels at consuming stacks on a single target. Then a mode arrives where fighting multiple enemies becomes the dominant strategy. Of course, I cannot know whether this was intentional. Maybe it wasn't. But I would be lying if I said I wasn't wondering whether the next operator, Camille, might benefit from this environment much more. I don't find increasing enemy quantity and variety alone to be particularly engaging. Without enough variables, Trial of Swordmancy risks becoming another permanent mode that looks impressive on paper but eventually loses its purpose. Much like Umbral Monument, my greatest fear is that it simply becomes another task on my checklist. A chore that I complete because there are rewards attached to it. Not because I genuinely want to. A dedicated combat mode is exactly what I wanted to see in Endfield. This is undeniably a step in the right direction. The problem is that after waiting so long, I expected a much larger step. Perhaps version 1.3 simply wasn't destined to be Enfield's most fortunate update. A slightly cruel joke, considering how much potential it had. But players can only continue saying, maybe the next update will be better. For so long. Eventually, those words need to be answered with results. At the moment, my feelings are fairly simple. I can see the improvements and the direction. But the speed of those improvements and the quality of the results still leave me wanting more. Even so, I would rather be disappointed by a first attempt than never see an attempt at all. At least now, Hypergriff has started asking the right question. I only hope the answer becomes better with time. Thank you for listening to the thoughts of an aging otaku who clearly spends far too much time analyzing game systems that most normal people would probably finish in 10 minutes. I'll see you again when Contingency Contract arrives. Ciao.